Own house. 3 cows. 2 children. A wife who baked bread that the village praised. He had never been hungry. He had never been wealthy. He had survived the plague, the wars, the bad harvests. He was, by any measure, safe. And yet, on that spring morning, he sold everything. The land went to a neighbor for half its value. The livestock sold at auction. The furniture, the tools, even his wife's wedding dress, auctioned in the village square. Within 3 weeks, Thomas Whitmore had converted his entire life into £63 sterling and 2 tickets on a merchant ship bound for the New World. He wasn't fleeing debt. He wasn't running from the law. He was chasing a promise. A preacher named Jeremiah Blackwood had come to his village and described a place called New Canaan, a colony in America where the land was fertile, the climate temperate, the natives friendly, and most importantly, where a man could worship God without interference from bishops or kings. Blackwood had shown letters. Dozens of them. Written by settlers already there. Letters describing harvests so abundant that grain rotted in the fields. Letters describing rivers thick with fish. Letters describing a new Eden. Thomas Whitmore believed every word. 6 months later, he would be dead. So would his wife. So would 473 other people who had bought shares in the Society of New Canaan. They would die of malaria, dysentery, starvation, and despair in a malarial swamp that Jeremiah Blackwood had never seen. The letters were forgeries. The colony was a fiction. The New Eden was a con. But here's what makes this story more than just a tragedy. Thomas Whitmore wasn't stupid. The people who followed Blackwood weren't gullible fools. They were rational actors making reasonable decisions based on available information. The con worked not because people were naive, but because the con was sophisticated. It exploited not greed, but hope. Not ignorance, but faith. And it worked because the victims couldn't verify the truth until it was far too late. You've been told that con artists prey on the stupid. But the most effective cons prey on the desperate. You've been told that people who lose everything in scams should have known better. But what if the system was designed to make verification impossible? What if the con was structured so that by the time you discovered the truth, you were already 3,000 miles from home, starving in a swamp, with no way back? This is not a story about one preacher and one failed colony. This is a story about how hope can be weaponized. How information can be controlled. How distance and time can be exploited to create perfect traps. And most importantly, how this pattern, this exact mechanism, repeats across centuries whenever desperate people meet charismatic promises. What if I told you that the mechanism Jeremiah Blackwood used in 1662 is still operating today? What if the same invisible architecture that trapped Thomas Whitmore still traps people now? And what if most people don't even see it? In the next 20 minutes, you'll see how this system actually worked. You'll understand why it was so effective. You'll see the hidden mechanics of manipulation, the sophisticated structure of control, and the inevitable mathematics of collapse. And most importantly, you'll see why this pattern never really ended. It just changed its costume. To understand how the New Canaan con worked, you have to understand the world that made it possible. In the middle of the 17th century, Europe was tearing itself apart over religion. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Christianity into dozens of competing sects, each convinced they alone possessed divine truth. England had its Anglicans. Scotland its Presbyterians. The continent had Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists, Mennonites, and countless smaller groups. And each government, each king, each local magistrate decided which version of Christianity was legal and which was heresy. If you worshipped the wrong way, the consequences were severe. In Massachusetts, Quakers were whipped, their ears were cropped, and 4 were hanged for refusing to stop preaching. In England, Catholics faced fines, imprisonment, and exclusion from public life. Baptists were arrested. Dissenters were exiled. The state didn't just regulate religion, it enforced it with violence. This created a massive population of people willing to risk everything for religious freedom. Thousands of families across Europe faced a choice: conform, hide, or leave. Conforming meant betraying their conscience. Hiding meant living in fear. Leaving meant selling everything, crossing a deadly ocean, and starting over in a wilderness 3,000 miles away. It was a terrible set of options. But for many, leaving seemed like the least terrible. And that desperation created opportunity. Not for the desperate themselves, but for the people who understood how to exploit desperation. America, in the popular imagination, was a blank slate. It was virgin wilderness, unclaimed and fertile. It was a place where a man could own land, real land, not just tenancy, and build a life without lords or bishops. The reality was far more complicated. Native peoples occupied the land. The climate was unfamiliar. The wilderness was hostile. Early colonies struggled with starvation, disease, and conflict. But most Europeans didn't know that. Information traveled slowly. Letters from the colonies took months to arrive, and most settlers couldn't write. The only information available to potential emigrants came from colonial promoters, people with a financial interest in recruitment. These promoters painted America in glowing terms, exaggerating the fertility of the soil, the mildness of the climate, and the ease of survival. Some of this was genuine optimism. Some of it was deliberate deception. But all of it created an information asymmetry. The promoters knew more than the emigrants. And in that gap between knowledge and ignorance, cons could flourish. The structure of colonial investment made this worse. Colonies required massive upfront capital. Ships, supplies, tools, livestock, weapons, all had to be purchased before a single settler set foot in America. To raise this capital, promoters sold shares. You could buy a share in a colonial venture, and in return, you would receive land, a voice in governance, and a share of profits. In theory, this was a reasonable investment structure. In practice, it was nearly impossible to verify. How could a farmer in Lincolnshire verify that the land actually existed? How could he verify the soil quality? How could he verify the promoter's claims? He couldn't. He had to trust. And trust, in the absence of verification, is a vulnerability. Enter Jeremiah Blackwood. Blackwood was a preacher, but not an ordinary one. He hadn't attended university. He held no official position in the Church of England. He was what contemporaries called a mechanic preacher, a self-taught, charismatic speaker who drew crowds through force of personality rather than institutional authority. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with a voice that could fill a field and eyes that seemed to see straight into your soul. He had been preaching for 20 years, moving from town to town, gathering followers, occasionally clashing with authorities. He believed, or claimed to believe, that the Church of England had become corrupted, that true worship required separation from worldly power, and that God was calling his chosen people to build a new Jerusalem in the wilderness. This wasn't an unusual belief. Many religious dissenters held similar views. What made Blackwood different was his solution. He didn't just preach about the New Jerusalem. He offered to sell it. In 1660, Blackwood announced the formation of the Society of New Canaan. He had secured, he claimed, a land grant in America, 20,000 acres in a temperate valley, fertile and unclaimed, perfect for settlement. He would organize the expedition, arrange the ships, purchase supplies, and lead the settlers to their promised land. In exchange, settlers would purchase shares. A share cost £10, roughly 6 months' wages for a laborer, or the price of 2 cows. For £10, you would receive 50 acres of land, a voice in the colony's governance, and a place on the ships. Blackwood promised to transport you, your family, and your possessions across the Atlantic and deliver you to New Canaan. Once there, you would be free, free to worship, free to own land, free to build a godly community. It sounded too good to be true. But Blackwood had proof. The genius of Blackwood's con was not in what he said, but in what he showed. He didn't just make promises. He provided evidence. And in an age before photography, before telegraphs, before any way to verify information across vast distances, evidence was whatever appeared credible. Blackwood traveled from town to town with a leather satchel filled with documents. Land charters. Maps. And most convincingly, letters. The letters were extraordinary. They were written in plain English, in the hand of common people. They described the Atlantic crossing, difficult but survivable. They described landfall in New Canaan, a sheltered harbor, a temperate climate, forests thick with game. They described the first harvest, grain growing so abundantly that the settlers had more than they could store. They described relations with the natives, peaceful, even friendly. One letter, allegedly written by a carpenter named John Fletcher, described building a house in a single week with timber so straight and abundant it seemed providential. Another, from a widow named Margaret Cole, described her children thriving in the clean air, free from the diseases that plagued English cities. A third, from a farmer named Robert Hayes, described soil so rich that crops grew twice as fast as in England. Blackwood read these letters aloud in village squares, in market halls, in churches where sympathetic ministers allowed him to speak. He read them with emotion, with tears in his eyes, as if he himself could hardly believe the miracle God had wrought. And people believed him. Why wouldn't they? The letters were specific. They included details, names of ships, dates of arrival, descriptions of weather. They weren't abstract promises. They were testimonials from real people. And Blackwood encouraged potential investors to write to these settlers themselves. He provided names and promised that letters could be sent via the Society's ships. Of course, the letters were forgeries. John Fletcher, Margaret Cole, Robert Hayes, none of them existed. Blackwood had written the letters himself, or hired scribes to produce them in different hands to avoid detection. The details were invented. The names were fabricated. The entire epistolary campaign was a fiction. But how could anyone know? If you were a farmer in Lincolnshire in 1661, how would you verify a letter from America? You couldn't travel there yourself to check. You couldn't call on the telephone. You couldn't search online. The only way to verify would be to write a letter, send it across the Atlantic, wait for a response, and hope it arrived. That process would take a minimum of 6 months, possibly a year. And by then, Blackwood would be in the next county, recruiting the next wave of investors. The con relied on temporal and spatial asymmetry. The distance was too great and the delay too long for verification. By the time you discovered the truth, the ship would have sailed, sometimes literally. But Blackwood's genius went deeper. He didn't just forge letters from settlers. He forged letters to settlers. Here's how it worked. A man would purchase a share, and Blackwood would encourage him to write to his relatives, explaining his decision and inviting them to join. The man would hand his letters to Blackwood, who promised to send them with the next ship. But Blackwood didn't send the letters. He destroyed them. Instead, he forged responses, letters allegedly from relatives, expressing support and sometimes even purchasing their own shares. This served multiple purposes. It isolated the investors from outside skepticism. It created the illusion of growing social proof. And it generated additional revenue. Within 18 months, Blackwood had sold nearly 800 shares. That's £8,000, a fortune equivalent to several $1 million today. He used some of this money to purchase ships and supplies. But he used far more to enrich himself, to fund his traveling ministry, and to pay a small staff of assistants who helped manage the growing operation. One of those assistants was a man named Samuel Hawthorne. Hawthorne was a former clerk, educated and capable of maintaining the society's account books. He was also a true believer. He genuinely thought Blackwood was doing God's work. He thought the letters were real, the colony was thriving, and that they were helping desperate people find freedom. Hawthorne's belief was crucial. He lent the operation credibility. When potential investors questioned Blackwood, Hawthorne would show them the account books, demonstrating that funds were being used to purchase ships and supplies. He didn't know that Blackwood was siphoning money. He didn't know the letters were forged. He believed the con as much as the victims. This is a pattern worth noting. The most effective cons include true believers in positions of visibility. They provide an honest face to a dishonest operation. They answer questions with genuine conviction because they themselves have been deceived. By the summer of 1662, Blackwood had sold enough shares to fill 2 ships. The first ship, the Providence, would carry 240 settlers, men, women, children. The second ship, the Covenant, would follow 3 months later with another 200. Blackwood organized a grand departure ceremony. He preached to the assembled families, reminding them that they were God's chosen people, embarking on a holy mission. He promised to follow on the second ship, after ensuring that all arrangements in England were complete. He blessed them. He prayed over them. He wept as they boarded. And then he watched the Providence disappear over the horizon, carrying 240 people toward a colony that didn't exist. The Providence crossed the Atlantic in 9 weeks, a reasonably fast passage. 14 people died during the voyage, mostly from dysentery and a fever that swept through the lower decks. This was considered normal. Atlantic crossings killed about 10 to 15% of passengers. The survivors considered themselves fortunate. They arrived at the coordinates Blackwood had provided in September 1662. They expected to find a sheltered harbor, cleared fields, houses built by the advance party Blackwood had promised. They found a river mouth choked with marsh grass. Low-lying wetlands. Thick humid air. Clouds of insects. No harbor. No houses. No people. The captain of the Providence, a merchant sailor named Thomas Gresham, consulted his charts. The coordinates were correct. This was the location Blackwood had specified. But there was no colony. Confusion turned to alarm. The passengers demanded answers. Gresham had none. He had been hired to transport settlers to New Canaan. He had delivered them to the coordinates provided. His contract was fulfilled. The settlers faced a choice. They could demand that Gresham take them back to England. But they had sold everything. They had no homes to return to. They had no money for return passage. Or they could disembark and try to survive. After 3 days of argument, they chose to disembark. What else could they do? They landed on a narrow stretch of firm ground between the river and the marsh. They unloaded supplies. They erected tents. They tried to make sense of their situation. Some believed this was a test of faith. Blackwood had promised that the colony would require hardship. Perhaps this was the hardship. Perhaps the advance party had been delayed. Perhaps they had misunderstood the location. They prayed. They waited. They hoped. Others believed they had been deceived. They wanted to send word back to England, to warn the second ship, to demand accountability. They drafted letters describing their situation and gave them to Captain Gresham, who promised to deliver them when he returned to England. Gresham sailed away. The settlers were alone. Within 2 weeks, people began to fall ill. It started with fevers, high, racking fevers that left people shivering despite the humid heat. Then came chills, sweats, delirium. some recovered. Many didn't. Children died first, then the elderly, then the strong. They didn't know they were experiencing malaria. They didn't know that the marsh was breeding mosquitoes carrying parasites that would devastate their population. They thought it was divine punishment, or bad air, or some curse of the land. They tried to relocate inland, but the terrain was swampy for miles. They tried to build shelters, but the wood was waterlogged and rotted quickly. They tried to plant crops, but the soil was acidic and poorly drained. They tried to fish, but they lacked proper nets and the fish were unfamiliar. By November, a third of the settlers were dead. By December, half. The survivors were starving, feverish, and desperate. And then, in January 1663, a miracle. A ship appeared on the horizon. It wasn't the Covenant, the second ship from the Society of New Canaan. It was a merchant vessel from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, traveling south along the coast. The captain, seeing smoke from the settlers' fires, anchored offshore to investigate. What he found horrified him. Skeletal figures wandering a swampy camp. Bodies left unburied because the survivors lacked the strength to dig graves. Children orphaned and starving. He took as many survivors as his ship could carry, about 40 people, and sailed for Massachusetts. The survivors told their story. They described Blackwood, the Society of New Canaan, the promises, the shares, the letters. They described arriving to find nothing, no colony, no supplies, no advance party. They described the malaria, the starvation, the deaths. The Massachusetts authorities listened with grim recognition. This wasn't the first time they had encountered colonial fraud. But the scale was shocking. Nearly 200 people dead. Another 200 aboard the Covenant, likely sailing toward the same trap. They immediately sent a ship to intercept the Covenant. By fortune, they found it still at sea, battling winter storms in the Atlantic. They boarded, explained the situation, and convinced the captain to redirect to Massachusetts rather than the false coordinates. The passengers of the Covenant were saved from the swamp. But they were not saved from ruin. They had sold everything. They had nothing to return to. They were stranded in Massachusetts, a colony that had its own struggles and no desire to absorb hundreds of destitute refugees. Some found work as indentured servants. Some died of exposure that winter. Some eventually scraped together enough to purchase small plots of marginal land. None ever recovered what they had lost. And Blackwood? When news of the disaster reached England in the spring of 1663, Jeremiah Blackwood was in Bristol, recruiting investors for a third ship. He had already collected deposits from nearly 100 families. He was planning a departure for June. He had given sermons describing the thriving colony, reading aloud new letters from settlers, letters he had forged, describing harvests and happiness that existed only in his imagination. And then Captain Gresham arrived with letters from the dying settlers. Letters describing the truth. Gresham, to his credit, had delivered the letters to relatives of the settlers. Within days, word spread. Families who had purchased shares demanded answers. Local magistrates began asking questions. Blackwood's operation began to unravel. Samuel Hawthorne, Blackwood's assistant, was devastated. He had believed. He had genuinely believed they were doing God's work. When he confronted Blackwood, demanding to see proof of the land grant, proof of the advance party, proof of anything, Blackwood's response was chilling. He didn't deny the deception. He justified it. According to Hawthorne's later testimony, Blackwood argued that the suffering was temporary. Yes, the first settlers had endured hardship. But hardship was how God tested faith. Yes, some had died. But they had died in pursuit of a holy vision. The colony would have succeeded if the settlers had possessed stronger faith, greater discipline, more willingness to suffer for righteousness. Blackwood claimed he had never lied about the spiritual reality of New Canaan. The physical location was irrelevant. What mattered was the idea of a godly community, separate from corruption, dedicated to pure worship. If the settlers had embraced that idea fully, they would have transformed whatever land they found into the promised paradise. This is a crucial psychological mechanism. Blackwood had begun to believe his own con. Or perhaps he had always believed it. Perhaps he had convinced himself that the physical details, the land grant, the advance party, the fertile valley, were symbolic truths that would manifest if believers showed sufficient faith. This is not uncommon among con artists who exploit religious belief. They externalize failure. If the scheme collapses, it's not because the scheme was fraudulent. It's because the victims lacked faith. The con becomes unfalsifiable. Success proves the con's validity. Failure proves the victim's unworthiness. Hawthorne was shattered. He had dedicated 2 years to the society. He had recruited friends and family. He had assured skeptics that Blackwood was honest. And now he understood, he had been a tool of deception. He went to the Bristol authorities and testified. He provided the account books, showing how Blackwood had siphoned funds. He described the forged letters. He named names. Blackwood was arrested in May 1663. The charges included fraud, theft, and obtaining money under false pretenses. He was held without bail. But here's where the story takes another dark turn. The legal system of the time was ill-equipped to handle this kind of fraud. Colonial investment was largely unregulated. There were no securities laws, no investor protections, no clear legal framework for prosecuting someone who sold shares in a non-existent colony. Moreover, many of Blackwood's investors didn't want him prosecuted. They wanted their money back. Prosecution wouldn't achieve that. Blackwood claimed his assets had been spent on ships and supplies, which was partially true. The money was gone. Some investors still believed in him. They argued that the disaster was not Blackwood's fault, but the settlers' failure to persevere. They organized petitions for his release. They claimed he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs. This divided the victims. Some wanted justice. Some wanted restitution. Some still wanted to believe. The legal case dragged on for months. And then, in October 1663, an epidemic swept through the Bristol jail. Typhus, most likely, spread by lice in the overcrowded cells. Blackwood contracted the fever. He died in November, still proclaiming his innocence, still insisting that New Canaan was a divine vision that had been betrayed by the faithless. He died believing his own lie. Or at least performing belief until his final breath. What made the New Canaan con so effective? It wasn't just Blackwood's charisma, though that mattered. It wasn't just the forged letters, though those were crucial. It was the system, a sophisticated architecture of deception that exploited multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. First, information asymmetry. Blackwood controlled all communication between investors and the supposed colony. Investors couldn't verify his claims because verification required resources they didn't have: time, money, and access to transatlantic communication. By the time truth could catch up to lies, the victims were already trapped. Second, temporal delay. The con relied on the slow pace of 17th-century communication. Letters took months to cross the Atlantic. Ships sailed on seasonal schedules. This delay created a buffer during which Blackwood could continue recruiting, collecting deposits, and expanding the scheme. Third, social proof through fabrication. The forged letters didn't just make claims. They created the illusion of a community of satisfied settlers. Humans trust testimonials more than abstract promises. We believe what other people report experiencing. Blackwood understood this and manufactured testimonials at scale. Fourth, exploitation of religious faith. Blackwood didn't sell land. He sold salvation. He sold escape from persecution, spiritual purity, divine favor. This made questioning the investment feel like questioning God. Skepticism became heresy. This psychological mechanism insulated the con from rational scrutiny. Fifth, sunk cost escalation. Once families sold their property and purchased shares, they were committed. Backing out meant admitting they had made a catastrophic mistake. Cognitive dissonance pushed them forward. They had to believe the investment was sound because the alternative was unbearable. Sixth, structural isolation. By forging letters from relatives, Blackwood cut investors off from external reality testing. He created an echo chamber where all information confirmed his narrative. Investors heard only what Blackwood wanted them to hear. Finally, the illusion of legitimacy. Hawthorne, the honest assistant, provided credibility. The account books, showing expenditures on ships and supplies, suggested fiscal responsibility. The formal structure of the society, shares, charters, official-looking documents, mimicked legitimate colonial ventures. The con didn't look like a con. It looked like a risky but plausible investment. This is the architecture of a perfect trap. Each element reinforces the others. Information control enables temporal delay. Temporal delay enables social proof fabrication. Social proof enables faith exploitation. Faith exploitation enables sunk cost escalation. And the entire structure is camouflaged by apparent legitimacy. By the time investors discovered the truth, they were financially ruined, geographically displaced, and often dead. Was the New Canaan disaster unique? No. In the 1680s, a Scottish scheme called the Darien Colony promised settlers wealth and religious freedom in Panama. The promoters sold shares across Scotland, collecting investments from nearly a quarter of the nation's liquid capital. The colony failed catastrophically. Tropical diseases killed most settlers within months. The survivors returned to Scotland bankrupt. The scheme's collapse contributed to Scotland's economic crisis and eventual political union with England. In the 1710s, the South Sea Company in England sold shares in a trading monopoly with Spanish America. The promoters used sophisticated marketing, celebrity endorsements, and fabricated profit reports to drive share prices to absurd heights. When the bubble collapsed in 1720, thousands of investors were ruined. The pattern was identical: information asymmetry, fabricated social proof, temporal delay, and faith in expert promises. In the 1830s, American land speculators sold plots in Western territories, describing fertile prairies that turned out to be arid deserts or already occupied indigenous land. The promoters used printed brochures with illustrations of abundant harvests and testimonials from satisfied settlers, testimonials that were often fabricated. In the 1920s, Florida real estate developers sold swampland described as beachfront paradise. They used celebrity endorsements, professional photography, and high-pressure sales tactics. Investors discovered too late that their prime real estate was underwater. In the 1990s, Albanian investment schemes promised extraordinary returns, claiming to be investing in international trade. The schemes were Ponzi operations. When they collapsed, riots erupted. The government fell. The pattern: information asymmetry, fabricated returns, social proof, and faith in too good to be true promises. In the 2010s, cryptocurrency schemes promised financial revolution and extraordinary gains. Many were Ponzi operations or pump-and-dump scams. The technology was real, but the specific schemes were fraudulent. The pattern: information asymmetry, complex technology few understood, social proof through testimonials and celebrity endorsements, temporal delay with promises of future value, and faith in disruptive innovation. Why does this pattern repeat? Because the underlying structure remains constant. Whenever you have information asymmetry, temporal delay, and desperate people seeking hope, the conditions exist for sophisticated cons. The specific details change, land schemes become stock bubbles, become cryptocurrency scams, but the mechanism stays the same. The con works because it exploits fundamental human vulnerabilities. We trust social proof. We struggle to verify distant claims. We commit to decisions through sunk costs. We want to believe in better futures. And we often lack the tools or knowledge to distinguish legitimate opportunities from sophisticated frauds. Moreover, the incentives favor the con artist. The upside is enormous, immediate wealth extracted from victims. The downside is often minimal, legal systems struggle to prosecute, especially across jurisdictions or when the fraud is novel. Victims often blame themselves rather than seeking justice. And even when prosecuted, the money is usually gone. This creates a perverse mathematics. The expected value of running a sophisticated con, for someone without ethical constraints, is positive. The costs are low and delayed. The benefits are immediate and substantial. As long as that equation holds, the pattern will repeat. What's happening today? Look at international development projects that promise transformation but deliver little. Look at for-profit colleges that promise career success but leave students in debt. Look at multi-level marketing schemes that promise financial independence but enrich only those at the top. Look at investment opportunities in emerging markets that promise extraordinary returns but rely on information most investors can't verify. The new Canaan pattern is everywhere. It just wears modern clothes. The final accounting of the new Canaan disaster was grim. Of the 240 settlers aboard the Providence, fewer than 40 survived. Most died in the swamp from malaria, dysentery, or starvation. A few survived by being rescued by the Massachusetts ship. The rest died that winter, either in the marsh or in Massachusetts, weakened by months of deprivation. The 200 settlers aboard the Covenant, intercepted before reaching the swamp, fared slightly better. Most survived physically, but they were financially destroyed. They had sold everything to purchase shares and passage. They had nothing to return to in England and insufficient resources to start over in Massachusetts. Some became indentured servants, selling years of labor to pay for basic necessities. Some disappeared into the margins of colonial society. A few eventually established themselves, but they never recovered their losses. The families who had purchased shares but not yet sailed, perhaps 300 more people, were spared the physical disaster but still suffered financial ruin. Their investments were worthless. The Society of New Canaan's assets, such as they were auctioned to pay creditors. Investors received pennies on the pound. Jeremiah Blackwood died in jail, his reputation destroyed but his conscience apparently clear. He maintained until his death that the disaster was a failure of faith, not a failure of his promises. He died believing, or claiming to believe, that New Canaan had been a divine vision betrayed by human weakness. Samuel Hawthorne, the assistant who exposed Blackwood, lived with guilt for the rest of his life. He had unknowingly helped recruit victims. He had vouched for Blackwood's honesty. Though he himself had been deceived, he felt responsible. He spent years trying to assist survivors, using what little resources he had to help families resettle or recover. He died in poverty in 1689, still trying to make amends for a crime he hadn't understood he was committing. The English legal system, confronted with a form of fraud it hadn't encountered before, struggled to respond. There were no clear statutes against selling shares in non-existent colonies. Contract law didn't quite fit. Criminal fraud required proving intent to deceive, which Blackwood's religious justifications complicated. The case dragged through courts for years, ultimately resolving nothing because Blackwood died and the money was gone. This legal inadequacy is part of the pattern. Con artists often operate in gray areas where law hasn't yet caught up to innovation. By the time legal frameworks develop, the specific con has evolved into something new. The new Canaan disaster teaches us something fundamental about power and exploitation. We think of cons as individual crimes, one bad actor deceiving gullible victims. But sophisticated cons are systems. They're architectures of deception that exploit structural vulnerabilities. Information asymmetry. Temporal delay. Social proof. Faith. Sunk costs. Each element is a lever. Together, they create traps that rational, intelligent people cannot escape. Blackwood didn't just lie. He built a machine that made lies indistinguishable from truth. He controlled information flow. He manufactured evidence. He exploited distance and delay. He weaponized hope and faith. And he created a system where by the time victims could verify anything, they were already destroyed. This matters because the same architecture still operates. Every time you encounter an investment opportunity you can't verify, you're facing potential information asymmetry. Every time you're told that skepticism reveals lack of vision or faith, you're experiencing manipulation. Every time returns are promised based on future conditions you can't assess, you're in the temporal delay trap. Every time success stories seem too consistent and convenient, consider that social proof can be manufactured. The lesson isn't cynicism. It's structural awareness. Understand the mechanisms of manipulation. Recognize the patterns. Ask, who controls information? Can I verify claims independently? What incentives exist? What happens if I'm wrong? Thomas Whitmore stood in his doorway in Lincolnshire and made a decision that killed him. He wasn't stupid. He was desperate and hopeful, facing a sophisticated system designed to exploit exactly those vulnerabilities. He couldn't see the trap because the trap was invisible until it closed. 473 people died or were ruined because one man understood how to weaponize hope. That's not just a tragedy. It's a template. And the template is still in use. If the new Canaan story teaches us anything, it's this: pay attention when promises sound too good. Question when verification is impossible. Be suspicious when skepticism is framed as moral failure. And understand that the most dangerous cons don't just steal your money. They steal your capacity to recognize you're being stolen from. Because 3 centuries later, the machine Jeremiah Blackwood built is still running. It's just selling different dreams to different people in different places. The swamp changes. The promises change. But the pattern stays the same. And somewhere, right now, someone is standing in a doorway, looking at a promise, making a decision. The ship is waiting. The letters are convincing. The hope is real. The swamp is waiting too.